Bienvenue à Paris et bienvenue sur scène.
Bill Gates, please, if you may come on stage this way. Fine. Here. You find sitting here? Thank you very much. Needless to say that my next two guests don't need introduction, but I would like to present you Bill Gates as a relentless activist. We all know here that you co-chair the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You're also the founder of a climate platform called Breakthrough Energy. We're very pleased and very honored to have you here today for a thrilling conversation with the Minister of Economy, Bruno Le Maire. Good morning to both of you. To start with, maybe we can hang on to the news a little bit. Bill Gates, 8 years ago, you attended the COP15 in Paris. You brought innovation to the table through mitigation and adaptation. You just came back from COP28 in Dubai. What do you take away from that trip? What is your mood? Are you optimistic, confident?
Yeah, I'm actually optimistic. In 2015, when France brought everyone together and got the very first agreement, that was a key milestone. But my engagement in that meeting was very much, hey, we need to put innovation on the agenda. And so a number of countries and I committed to fund lots of R&D to try to make the cost of reducing emissions as low as possible. And so it's pretty amazing to me that just 8 years later, going to Dubai, there was an area with about 100 companies with new ways of doing things. And it was across every area of emission: new batteries, new ways of making beef, new ways of making steel, new ways of making cement. And these companies, some of them are still at an early stage, but you could see the big companies coming and looking at that and saying, okay, let's work together on steel, let's work together on cement. And so particularly because we know now that if we try to do it with brute force, if we make it super expensive, we're going to get some negative reaction to that. We probably should have always known that, but we definitely know that now. And so the way to square the fact that climate is incredibly important and people's willingness to bear very high cost, not only in rich countries, but also in these middle-income countries whose historical emissions have been lower, the answer is innovation. So I was thrilled with what I saw at that COP. The COP did a better job on innovation, adaptation, and thinking about food and health than any previous COP. Now, I say that knowing that, yes, we are behind on our short-term goals. So, it's a cup maybe two-thirds full, and we need to keep doubling down on this cause.
And you just talked about this innovative young company paving the way for the future. Where do we go from that COP28? And as far as you're concerned, in which direction do you intend to put your future investments?
Well, my work in climate, a lot of it's philanthropic, like better models, examining policies. And then some of it's what they sometimes call double bottom line, where it's investing in companies, and if those companies succeed, they will help with the climate, and there'll be some return, which if overall that works out, that will go to the health work of the Gates Foundation. And so, in cement, there's a company here called Ecosem, small company, but working with big companies. In terms of mining, there's a company here, Iraq, that has a new approach to help with mining. So it's pretty broad. Fission and fusion are hard. So those aren't small companies or they're going to have to grow to be big. I have a group called TerraPower that's, talking with France about, okay, we need fission and fusion to be part of this solution. And, those reactors have been expensive, so how do we get them to be a lot less expensive? So it's both philanthropic grant capital, which is added up to billions, and then other billions that are going into these high-risk but high-impact investments.
Thank you. What about your vision, Monsieur le Ministre? Do you think this COP28 should lead us to make a call for the public and the private sector to get together as to promote efficient way to finally reach the goal of the Paris Agreement?
I think it is one of the key questions. And as I said, and as Bill said, the climate transition will be very costly, around 60 to 70 billion euros only for France each year, following the assessments made by our friends. First, belief, people won't bear very high costs for the climate transition. And we should really get rid of that idea that we just have to put the cost on the shoulders of the consumers. We tried in France, we failed, it led to the Yellow Jacket movement, so let's try another way. I think that the first way is to put incentives for the citizen and for the consumers to go the way of the net zero transition. And in France we implemented many financial incentives that proved to be very efficient, especially for low-income households. Just to quote a few, a subsidy for the renovation of buildings, the so-called MaPrimeRénov', a subsidy to buy an electric car up to 7,000 euros per car. It is quite efficient, and it is the best way of incentivizing the people to go the route of climate transition. Second element, I think that both the public and private sectors need to invest massively. All public and private sectors must step up their game. And I don't believe that everything should rely only on the public funding, because there is a lack of public funding everywhere in Europe. So you can use the public funding as a leverage for private funding. But you should never believe that each year we will have to spend between 60 to 70 billion euros on public money to fund the climate change, because it is out of reach for the French public treasury. The third element that I would like to emphasize is that we also need to put some very clear rules to stop private investments in fossil fuels. And the way we are channeling the private investments to the best practices is quite significant and quite efficient. I strongly believe that private funding should be directed towards the net zero transition and away from fossil fuels. That's why, for instance, in France, we have been advocating to end public and private finance for all new coal facilities. That's the position that has been taken by President Macron at COP28. And this is why also I personally banned companies active in the exploitation of fossil fuel from the social and responsible investment label. We need to avoid any greenwashing, and the fact that we took that decision is, I think, a very clear element of our strong determination to channel the private investment to the green transition.
Thank you very much. We will come back to that funding question in a minute. But let's now maybe have a closer look on the mix between mitigation and adaptation. We can talk a bit about the breakthrough energy venture funds. And with this fund, you invest across the board in companies aiming at reducing the greenhouse gas emission. What would you say are your priorities today, sector-wise, country-wise? What you're aiming at directly?
Yeah, so breakthrough energy I did the mitigation work outside the foundation because it's really very capitalistic. I mean, the energy market's a big market, the industrial market, and so it's about philanthropic funding for policy work and models, for ideas that are so new they can't be funded. We grant money, what we call fellows. We've had a number of those in France. And then when their ideas get well formed, we give high-risk venture funding. And then once those are ready to move out of the lab, we give what we call catalyst funding for new projects. And so we announced with the European Union a Swedish project for clean marine fuel and a energy storage project in Italy, and those are just the first two. We hope there'll be lots of those where we help fund that risky project. So mitigation, we've got to go as fast as we can. We know that there will have to be some adaptation, and because the main suffering, sadly, will be in these developing countries that are near the equator. We can almost think of climate change as that your climate will be like somebody who is far south of you. But if you're near the equator, that's a climate that no one ever had to deal with. And because those are poor farmers, whose seeds fail with the heat and the drought, we need to help them. And so the foundation work is in that adaptation space, including the biggest impact there is better seeds, better advice for the farmers, better weather data. Some of that's AI-based weather forecasting. And so I would say this COP did a better job of putting adaptation on the agenda. We had a lot of food announcements. We had a lot of health announcements. But it's always easy to focus mostly on mitigation because in the rich countries, that's the big issue. But in terms of the inequities we have and the very limited money we have to help those developing countries, we have to maintain what we've been doing and help with adaptation.
And what in terms of timeline, the horizon of the investment, considering the emergency to act? How do you approach this?
Well, some things are available today, like, where you can change your windows in the building and you save on your electric bill. It's actually a net win. You can seal the building a little better. There are areas like industrial heat where instead of using natural gas, you use solar panels and a big heat store. And that can be done. There's some companies here in France who are starting to do that. That can be done, again, saving money and reducing the footprint. There are other things like low-cost fission or fusion that are, out in the future, and we can't even say for sure, when would we have those improvements. We need to invest in them, but that'll be difficult. A lot of the bottlenecks in terms of rolling things out are taking the wind and the solar and saying, okay, why can't we go faster? And France has done some things to try and get that permitting process to be better. The European grid is going to have to be, about 3 times bigger than it is today, and the rate of addition to that grid is way below, what's going to be necessary. So to be able to take the combination of the nuclear energy, the wind and the sun energy, and make sure we keep reliability, the fact that Europe will do that as a whole is super important. And, so we need to, that's an area for immediate action. No country is doing the grid as fast as they should, not China, not the U.S., but we all need to spur each other on in order to do that piece. For cars, the high end of the car range, the electric cars are great today. It's much harder if you park on the street or the low end, and so we have to keep driving that innovation. So across every area of innovation, consumers can help us by stretching to buy an electric car if possible, or an electric heat pump, or food that's made a low emissions way. So it's the government, but not the government alone. It's the rich companies and the consumers are going to drive us So the rich countries owe it to the world not only to reduce their emissions, but to drive down the cost of these green products.
Thank you very much. I would like maybe now we narrow the focus on France. Monsieur le Ministre, according to you, what are the biggest technological opportunities we can see in that country, the major gaps we have to fill, including in terms of funding, the strengths we have as a big nuclear nation as well, and maybe the next step for us to build a proper market-building strategy that is efficient?
Well, I think one of the most promising technologies is an existing one. It is the nuclear technology. And it is a chance for France to have all those nuclear plants, and that's why we decided with President Macron to open 6 new nuclear plants, because I really think that there won't be any success in the fight against climate change without nuclear energy. So the challenge now is to build those 6 new nuclear plants by 2035. The second challenge in the nuclear energy is to think about the new technologies. We have been talking with Bill just before this exchange of views on the SMR, the small and medium-sized reactors. We just have to think about the productivity and financial efficiency of the SMR. We'll see whether it can be the case over the next years, but we have to think also about the financial efficiency of this new technology. And the very last step will be fusion. We are working on these disruptive technologies with many partners, including the US, but we really want to remain one of the key nuclear powers in the world. Second, we want to invest more in renewable energies, and we have to move really faster. This is one of the key questions for France, how to build a new onshore wind capacity, new solar capacity, massively and rapidly. And getting rid of some norms, getting rid of some administrative hurdles is absolutely key if we want to move rapidly and very fast on those technologies. One of the key questions is also the point raised by Bill Gates in his book about the green premium. We need to reduce the green premium of clean technologies because as starting technologies, they are far too costly for private investments. And this is exactly why we devoted 50% of the 54 billion euros France 2030 plan to foster research and development and innovation in hydrogen, in batteries, in electric grids, in green steel, in green cement, because otherwise there will be a lack of private investment because there is not enough financial leverage to be attractive for private investments. The very last point is the green industry. Nuclear energy, renewables, and the point of green premium, and green industry. We should all be aware that over the 3 next years will be decided the industrial landscape of the 21st century, everywhere in the world. And that's why we really want to be one of the most attractive countries around the world to open new industrial green plants. I just put in place a tax credit for subsidizing the production in France of batteries, of wind turbines, on solar panels, on heat pumps, based on the model of the Biden's administration. Because I strongly believe that this is now the time to open those new green industrial plants. So this is absolutely key. We need to have at the national level and also at the European level very key decisions to attract more investments and to open new industrial plants in our territory and in our continent.
Thank you very much. Bill Gates, I've seen you nodding quite a lot about what the minister was saying. So what's your view on this key factor of nuclear power, on renewable energy, on also quality of research and engineers we have here in France? Are we well positioned in the race, would you say?
Yeah, I have an application on my phone where you can look at the electricity generation all over the world, and if it's fairly green, the country is green, and if it's not, it's black in different shades. And of course, France, because of the nuclear, looks super good. And so anyone who's coming and wanting to do an industrial plant that uses electricity, that electricity is overwhelmingly clean electricity. It doesn't mean, no one's saying nuclear only. Nuclear is fantastic because it's not weather dependent. Now, we need to do much better on the cost of nuclear. And so there's a lot of brainstorming about what is the innovation to bring these prices down. Does it mean going to the small size? Does it mean changing the way we do the cooling? And there's kind of a renaissance, particularly because of digital modeling, at looking at new nuclear reactors. And a company I fund, TerraPower, is in constant discussions with both French research and commercial interests about, okay, what's the path? These first reactors, yes, they should build EPRs. But what is the design after that that should bring the cost down dramatically? Because we need the nuclear, we need cheap electricity everywhere. Even Africa, sadly, has almost no electricity of any kind. And so helping them start out in a clean way, which would be a mix of green and nuclear, really would make a big difference for uplifting those countries. And, as we go about all this climate work, our ongoing equity agenda, in a sense, of helping with vaccines, of helping uplift those economies, we can't forget that because, it's even harder for them because of climate change. And so the demands on the limited resources for the aid to those countries and to fund these new R&D things, it means we're going to have to spend the money very well. Because the innovation is going faster than I expected, I am quite optimistic. Every area of emissions, electricity, transport, industrial, agriculture, and buildings, those are the big five, I'm seeing companies that, as they pair up with the large companies, connect to these government programs that are encouraging them to go faster, that we can really start to bring emissions down. We've at least, we're flat now. We're not going up, but we're still not yet going down. And we really need to as fast as we can.
So let's move now on to adaptation and the question of funding. We've seen in the 2023 UN adaptation report that funding has been decreasing over the years, while the needs for adaptation financing have kept growing. Does that mean, Bill Gates, that we have somehow lost track of the goal set out at COP26, which was, I reminded for the audience, doubling down the financing for adaptation by 2025? So we need to catch up. How do we do that?
Well, in the early days of the climate movement, people didn't like talking about adaptation because they were like, oh, that's admitting that we're going to let some warming take place. Fortunately, the movement has said, okay, we also need to do adaptation. It's never gotten the effort it deserves. And the way that they do accounting for what counts as adaptation is a little soft. It's a new area. There's some things that should be counted, like everything you do to improve health should be counted. And there's some things in there that probably shouldn't be counted. The overall generosity of the rich world to these developing countries, the development aid budgets, I'm always saying to every country, you should increase your development aid budget. And in Europe, of course, the development aid budgets are higher than other places. The dream has been to get to 0.7%. France is on a path to that. The UK was there, but is now not there. So it's going to be, the demand for funds is very, very strong. I go to Africa a lot. I see the crops are failing. That leads to malnutrition. malnutrition leads to either being susceptible to die from diseases. And so keeping in mind the very poorest countries is key. Most people don't know that since the year 2000, we've made a lot of progress. In the year 2000, over 10 million children under 5 died. Malaria, diarrhea, pneumonia. By 2019, because of generous funding from government donors, including France, things like the vaccine fund are responsible for cutting those deaths down below 5 million. And most people aren't even aware that we did that incredible thing. And that's in the face of climate, in the face of all these things. And we can continue that. The goal was to cut it in half again by 2030, but because of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, it'll take us till sometime in the 2030s. But we will have cut deaths by a factor of 4, and we can't, as we do climate, we need to continue that work. It's all about human development. It's not about just, if you only do climate and you stop doing vaccines, then sadly you're worse off. And Africa, Asia's doing quite well. A lot of big challenges in Africa, including instability. And so we really need to come together on, okay, what is the best strategy for Africa? And my foundation works very closely with France on these issues.
Thank you very much. What are the main challenges, Minister, for France in adapting our society, our economy, fighting inequalities as well at home, promoting a fair transition? What can we do?
I really think that we need a strategy based on a mix of changing and adaptation. First of all, I really share the optimistic point of view expressed by Bill. I really think that we can bring the CO2 emissions down over the next years, and that we should be more determined, but also more confident about the possibility of reducing the CO2 emissions over the next years. We can be successful thanks to innovation. And in a certain way, climate change could be a huge opportunity for many countries, developing or developed countries. It could be a chance for many SMEs, for many private companies, for many scientists, researchers everywhere in the world, and especially in France and in Europe. It could be a chance to increase the level of productivity of our economies in Europe. You know that there is a lack of productivity everywhere in Europe. And due to the lack of productivity, a lack of growth, a lack of jobs, a lack of prosperity, a lack of equality in our societies. Thanks to the climate change, we don't have any other possibility but to put more innovation in our economies. And this innovation could bring more productivity and more prosperity for all of our citizens. Innovation must be everywhere, every time in our societies and in our economies. And in that perspective, climate change could be a chance for the developed societies. But nevertheless, we also need to address the consequences of climate change right now, which means adaptation. We need to take very strong measures. Just take the example of insurance. The 2022 drought in France cost around 3 billion euros. The 2021 floods in Germany cost more than 41 billion euros. So we don't have any other possibility but to think about this adaptation, to think long term, to reform our insurance system in order to ensure that everyone will still have access to insurance in the decades to come. So the mix of changing and adaptation is, to me, the right strategy to fight the consequences of climate change and also to make the climate change a chance for our societies.
And do you fear, Mr. Minister, that we can overcome the resistance? There might be some resistance from the public and for climato-sceptic people. Do you think we can overcome and convince them that it's the good cause for them too?
Yes, I'm totally convinced that we can convince the people to change if there are incentives to do so and not only obligations.
Thank you. We will debate all that question all along the round table. But now maybe coming back to the big picture. Do you think that the economic growth is in itself compatible with climate change? Is it just a question of adjusting the model, adjusting our expectation of the level of growth, the speed of growth, or do we need to change the paradigm?
On balance, we won't change the paradigm. It's fair to say that in rich countries, yes, we probably travel too much, our cars are too big, and so there is some reduction that people should feel social pressure for. For example, private aviation should be forced to buy green aviation fuel. There's no reason not to do that because it would create a market so that we can bring the cost down and eventually be able to use that for all commercial flights. But if we look at where are the emissions today are less than 30% in the rich countries. So even if they, could cut their consumption by half, that's only a 15% reduction, and we need to get to zero. And so the responsibility of the rich countries is both to get to zero, which will mostly be new approaches, and to show how to do that in such an economic way that we can turn to the middle income countries like India and say, okay, here's how you make cement, and it doesn't cost more. If we try and say to them, hey, make your cement, currently green cement costs over double, they're building basic roads and shelter. They're not building mansions. It's just basic justice to allow India to achieve a standard of living that we would all recognize as something that every human ought to have available. And so for these countries, since we don't have enough money to subsidize those green premiums, only through innovation can we get the adoption, and that's 60% of the emissions. And so and that's growing. The 30% is shrinking, and that 60% is growing because the food availability and shelter and things are going well, and we should applaud that. The economic growth in those countries is uplifting those citizens, and yes, I believe we can do that and get rid of all of those emissions.
And do you think that in those countries, low and middle income countries, the readiness to adopt and implement our technologies, it's okay, and it would be effective and efficient very quickly?
Well, the technologies of how you make cement and steel, or how you make paper, plastics, or, we all use cows, we all use chickens. These are global things. The only thing that's really local is how you do your electric grid. So if you're a country like Japan, you're not going to do much solar. You're going to do some wind, and to get to 100% green without depending on other countries, some form of nuclear fission or fusion will be absolutely necessary there. So there's some difference on how you do electricity, but almost every form of emission, from food to industrial to planes, these are global technologies. And so no matter where it's invented, I'm happy if it's invented in China or France or Africa, but the centers of innovation are very much in the rich countries. So 80 to 90% of these cost-reducing approaches are going to come out of, like Dioxycycle, a French company, or I mentioned Ecos in Morocco. I've funded 100 of these, and I'd say there's another 100 that are also quite fantastic, that at least at the lab level are showing great results. So this is a global thing. I do not think the middle-income countries are going to pay a lot more money they're not going to pay high green premiums because they'll say their historical emissions per person are very, very low. And so they'll turn to us. But if you do the math, that would mean our aid budgets would have to be 5 times larger just for those subsidizations, even if you stop buying vaccines and all those other things. So, how do you deal with that dilemma? In a way, the challenge that when you put the diesel tax on, people were like, okay, who should pay for this? That fact that started this process of, okay, it is too expensive, brute force. I think that, was a valuable thing. And I get to see the early innovation. And that's why I come into this discussion probably more optimistic than other people who also care very, very deeply about climate challenges.
Thank you. What is your view, Monsieur le Ministre, on this balance and compatibility between economic growth and climate change?
I see 3 key challenges for France to address that issue. The first one is to be a European example of this new growth, where a decoupling between growth and greenhouse gases emissions is possible. And I just want to repeat that from 2005 to 2018, our economy grew 15% and our greenhouse gases emissions fell by 20%. So we can prove that there is the possibility at the national level to have that decoupling and to build a new growth where growth and fight against climate change are consistent. The second key challenge is to help developing countries to face the climate change. Because having a success at the French national level or at the European level with a total failure in the developing countries would mean a global failure for the planet. And we should be aware of the fact that after the COVID crisis, the gap between developing countries and developed countries has grown up. And there is a need to maintain the same level of public support to those countries. That's the decision that we have been taken with President Macron, to keep the same level of public support for developing countries, because we strongly believe that a growing gap between developing and developed countries would mean a radical and total failure in the fight against climate change. Helping the developing countries would mean, for instance, to ensure to them access to our key technologies. If we are developing green technologies and green industry in the European countries and in France, we should guarantee that developing countries can get access to those technologies and can get use of those technologies. And we should also have a global strategy. I share the point of view expressed by Bill on the necessity to have a climate strategy, but also a strategy for health, for vaccines, because if we are successful in the fight against climate change, but we are not successful in fighting against new diseases or all diseases in the developing countries, then it will be a global failure for all of us. And the third point of this global strategy, new growth in France and the decoupling, helping developing countries, the third challenge is maybe the most difficult one. It is to engage the new superpowers. I mean China, India, and the Gulf countries. Because having a success at the European level, reducing our CO2 emissions at the European level, when China is opening new coal plants, will mean once again a failure at the global level. You know, there has been many critics about the fact that the COP28 took place in the Gulf countries, in the UAE. I think it is wrong. If we want to engage those countries, we need to keep a very tight channel of discussion, of dialogue between European countries, US and the new superpowers. Otherwise, at the world level, we won't be successful.
Thank you very much. In the last few minutes that we are left, I would ask you maybe to answer me. If I ask you, what makes you optimistic about climate change? If we see this glass half full, you say quarter full a few minutes ago. 2 or 3 arguments. So why are you optimistic about it?
Well, when I came in 2015 for what was a fantastic conference, I wasn't sure would bright entrepreneurs show up who said, here's how you make new steel. I mean, we haven't changed the way we make steel for a long time. It's like every 30 years, you know, something comes along. The same thing for the agricultural sector. You know, beef, and now I see 2 very amazing approaches. By improving the cow breeding and giving them some other inputs, we can reduce their methane emissions. And this new prioritization of the methane work, I applaud that, because in terms of the near-term temperature increase, methane plays a very big role. So across every area, when we raised that $1 billion fund and we said, hey, we only fund people who can significantly reduce climate change, I didn't know what would show up. And the fact that now we have over 100 companies, there's over 100 great companies funded by others, that is a surprise to me. And you know, we've made it this far without saying the word AI. That's pretty good in a conference nowadays. But I will add that the use of AI to understand the science of fusion, the science of materials, the science of making cheap meat, that's accelerating our innovation prospects. And so, no, we won't meet the 1.5 degree thing. It's just the scale and the speed of change is too much. But we won't, you know, miss by much because of these innovations. And, you know, France is playing a very important role in this. The COP28 meeting, you know, it seems crazy, 70,000 people flying, you know, which is a big greenhouse gas thing. And yet, when I saw the meetings of, okay, let's pilot these technologies. At first, they'll be expensive, but let's get them down. This thing is happening, which 8 years ago I wasn't sure it would come together.
Thanks for sharing your optimism and confidence. Monsieur le Ministre, one last word on your optimistic view as well on why can we make this climate change somehow good? I know it's strange to put it that way, but...
Just 3 key words. The first one that makes me more optimistic is awareness. There is an awareness on the reality of climate change. And this is something totally new. Of course, there are some critics about the reality of climate change. There are some people that remain skeptical. But nevertheless, there is, at the world level, a global awareness of the climate change and the necessity to fight against climate change. This is something new, and this is something that makes me more optimistic. There is an awareness on the necessity to fight for biodiversity, to fight against CO2 emissions, and I would say to fight for a better world. And that's something that makes me really optimistic. The second word would be innovation. We spoke a lot about innovation because I really think that this is the key to be successful in the fight against climate change. Science has never been so necessary. And this is quite good news. Science means innovation, and innovation means productivity. And from the point of view of the Minister of Economy and Finance, where we all know that there is a lack of productivity in European countries. I just raised the point. Innovation will bring more productivity, more prosperity, more jobs, and I think will improve the daily life of the European citizen. And the very last word is cooperation. Awareness, innovation, and cooperation. We cannot be successful in the fight against climate change without cooperation among citizens, without cooperation between private and public funding, without cooperation between the United States and Europe, between all developed countries, between developing and developed countries. So if we can build on this new concept of international cooperation, that makes me more optimistic for the years to come.
Thank you very much for sharing. We needed that optimism and your vision. Thank you very much for having been with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bien, nous allons poursuivre dans quelques instants nos échanges. Merci beaucoup à vous. Je vous invite à reprendre place.